All right, here we go. Hi, everybody. My name is Caleb, and I am a member of this group, but I am doing this remotely. And I know that sometimes it can be hard to hear me on the iPad that I FaceTime in on. So I just decided to go ahead and record this on my iPad, and I will be sending it and putting it onto a slide presentation. So, I'm sorry if you hear any background noises. There are 3 dogs with very clickety-clackety nails on a hardwood floor. So, if you hear click, 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 that's what that is. But I do apologize in advance. So, let me give us an introduction as to why we need trauma-informed instruction and how it affects our brain, how trauma affects the brain, and how we can then model our instruction and build our curriculum based around that. So, I'm going to do this super fancy and I took some screenshots of some stuff. The article that I read was out of Cornell, and this really had to do with the learning cycle and then how this fancy chemical called cortisol can really screw it all up for our kids living in traumatic situations. Now, I'd like to go ahead and give a definition of trauma. It's not like physical trauma, like a trauma nurse in the ER. It can be, but we also have some traumas such as extreme poverty or neglect or malnutrition or really loud households or an incredibly stressful bus ride or the teacher will not stop yelling at me. Many, many things can be considered traumatic to a child in their experience. So it is extremely important that we are cautious of these things. So let me just walk you through kind of the learning cycle and how our brain processes all this information. So here's a nice visual that you've all been looking at. It's called the brain learning cycle, and it's pulled directly from my article. And I did not write down the author's name, but look at what this fancy iPad can do. Let me scroll back up to the beginning. James E. Zoll, published in a book, The Art of Changing the Brain. Publisher Stylus, Arlington, Virginia. It's available on Amazon if you want to hit it up. He's a professor out of Cornell. Anywho, brain learning cycle. I'm talking with my hands a lot, so I hope that is conveyed. But essentially what happens, and I'll go into a visual here in a second, is our brains receive a stimulus through our brainstem. We call it our reptilian brain. It is our most instinctual part of our brain. It is the fight or flight part of our brain, and unfortunately that is where most of our children in trauma live within their brain. So, once we receive that sensory input in our brainstem, we then move into our inner brain or our thalamus. And that part of our brain is more like our emotional, feeling, ooey gooey, where you're going to make decisions with your heart versus your head. From there, we then move into our working memory and our long-term memory, also called our hippocampus or our outer brain. And that's where information is stored if it's deemed necessary by the thalamus. And then, that process is repeated. Let me flip over to a picture here. I would like to mark up this picture so I can talk to you about it. Come on. So, I'm going to go with black first. So this right here is our reptilian brain, our brain stem. This is our fight or flight, okay? Sensory input comes in from out here. Say this is me talking about vowel teams, O-U-O-W, ow, house, mouse, owl. So that goes into our brain stem, processed through here. It's an impulse. Literally just the vibrations from my voice are put into that brain stem. From there, we then go into our thalamus, where the sensory input takes place. If it's deemed necessary, and if the thalamus is stimulated, it goes into our working memory in our hippocampus. And as long as we retrieve it, we'll have that information forever. But here is the kicker, boys and girls. We have this nasty thing. Well, I guess I shouldn't say it's a nasty thing. We have this thing in our brain called a pituitary gland, or an adrenal gland. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I am told it's somewhere in here. Maybe it's this thing. I couldn't really tell you. But it's part of our endocrine system, and it produces a chemical called cortisol. I'm sure many of us have heard about it, especially if you have a bum knee or a bad back. It is a steroid that we inject to help our bodies do what it is instinctually meant to do. And that is all that this chemical is good for. So, excuse me, when our brains produce cortisol, I should also add, cortisol is a stress-triggered chemical. So, if our students are living in a high trauma situation where there's a lot of stress, where there's a lot of yelling, where there's a lot of noise, moving, not getting fed, a lot of just stress and bad things for kids, what do you think their pituitary gland and adrenal gland are doing? Okay, I think that's enough think time. It's producing a lot of cortisol. So, when that sensory input does come in, remember our friend OW, house mouse, owl, brown, okay, when it comes in here, if our Trevor the trauma monster is at work, our pituitary glands are working extra hard to just make the brain do instinctually what it is meant to do, which is survive. So, do you think any of this sensory input is getting through here? Boop, 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 boop. Nope, the answer is no. So, without addressing the trauma that these students are going through and trying to erase some of this cortisol and this stress that we put on 6-year-olds, our instruction is pointless. This whole gig is pointless if we don't address this. Bowel teams are pointless. Number bonds are pointless if you don't address trauma. Thank you.